Hey guys, so since I'm over here starving my ass off due to a lack of money, I'm just gonna go ahead and get the sponsor out of the way in the very beginning of the video. Hope that's okay. Well, too bad. You're stuck here till the end of it. Deal with it! This video is sponsored by Exter. Exter is the #1 smart wallet brand that'll help make your everyday life that much easier. Coming in various different forms such as Italian leather, space-grade aluminum, and carbon fiber, these wallets are strong, clean, and environmentally friendly. These wallets also come with a special tracker that will allow you to keep track of your wallets whenever you lose them. So if a thief takes your wallet and invades the Congos like he's Belgian or something, you'll know right away and you'll be able to join him. You know, if you're terrible. So use my code RaisorBlade in all caps to save some money on a quality product. And just in time for the Black Friday sale too, which can get you 35% off your total purchase. Alongside with my code, you'll be getting almost half off your entire order. That's right, almost half off. And if you spend more than $200 on your order, we'll even include a free cash clip. It don't get no better than that. But you better hurry, because this deal won't last long, and you'll be supporting my channel along the way. So special thanks to Exter once again for sponsoring this video. Now to bore you with an actual history lesson. Look, sorry we're not all oversimplified or Sabaton guys, okay? I'm doing my best here. So go to the link in the description and help a brother out, come on! History. Without it, we'd never learn anything. And sometimes we still don't. But I've always found history to be fascinating. From the trenches of World War I, from the Bay of Pigs to the times of ancient Vikings, history is full of great stories, like that time that Australia actually went to war against a bunch of emus. Yup. Did you know that the Confederacy actually owned a camel? Yes, Douglas the camel has his own grave in Vicksburg, Mississippi. Look it up. Say, have you ever heard of a man by the name of Francis Pigamagapo? Surely you must have heard of Francis Pigamagapo, deadliest sniper in all of World War I, with a credited 378 kills to his name, and he lasted throughout the entire war. Made his way until the end, alive! My point is, history is full of great stories, begging to be told to the masses. And what better way to tell those stories than through the medium of Oh, Jesus, I've only been doing that voice for like a minute and I can already tell I was going to get old fast. Don't worry, I'm not doing it anymore, I promise. So sometime last year, I started doing these history reviews where I look less at the quality of the film itself and more at its historical accuracy, or inaccuracy, to be honest. I wanted to do more of these reviews, but it just kind of got away from me over the last year, so I figured, hey, why not just make a month out of it? Let's make November History Month. I asked you guys what would be great suggestions for history reviews, and I did get some good recommendations, but others, I don't think people really understood what I was asking for. You see, to do a history review, the movie has to be mainly about a historical figure or an event. If it just happens to have a real event in the movie but doesn't focus that much on it, then a history review can't really happen. I've gotten multiple requests for the movie Coco, which is about a real holiday, but the story and characters are mostly purely fictional. Apparently Mama Coco was inspired by a real woman in Latin America, but yeah, that's a huge rabbit hole that I do not have the time to dive into today. My point is, the majority of the movie has to be about the person or the event. Anastasia was a good example. Pocahontas was a good example. And another good example is the one we're discussing today, Balto. Balto was an animated movie released on December 22nd, 1995. It was also the final film released by Steven Spielberg's animation studio, Amblimation, before its doors closed down officially in 1997. The film is about a half-dog, half-wolf named Balto who lives in the small town of Nome, Alaska. While being bullied for being a half-breed, he falls in love with a husky named Jenna and longs to be accepted by the town. One day, Jenna's owner, Rosie, becomes sick and it's revealed she has diphtheria, a disease that, under normal circumstances, would be treatable. But sadly, the city is all out of antitoxin, and without it, the children of Nome will surely die. In the movie, as you'd expect, Balto retrieves the medicine, saves the kids, gets the girl, you get the drift. He becomes popular and blah 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 blah, behold a movie. Overall, it's a solid but not remarkable movie. The story is rather generic and predictable. The comic relief is rather annoying, to be honest. but man, this really is a beautiful movie to look at. Sadly, the movie didn't do too well financially, critics weren't too impressed by it, and the movie would only go on to make about a third of its budget back. Maybe someday we'll come back and give this movie a proper review in the future, but for now, we're looking at the real Balto. This Balto. So, let's start from the very beginning with Alaska. Because why not? Originally, the state of Alaska was owned by the Russian Empire, but Russia, believing it to be rather useless land, decided to sell it. So they go to the United States and go, "Hey, you're obsessed with taking land that doesn't belong to you. How about you buy some land instead?" And the United States replied, "How about we just do both instead?" You know what? Fair enough. And for $7.2 million, or $140 million in today's money, Alaska was officially part of the United States. It wouldn't become a state until January 3rd, 1959, but effectively it was a part of the United States as a territory. During the late 19th century, the gold rush began, and as a result, hundreds if not thousands of people came flooding in, hoping to find some of that precious gold. Which is really dumb because everybody knows that gold makes for terrible armor. By 1925, Nome, Alaska had become a tight-knit community. About 1,300 people lived in the city at the time, one of them being a man known as Leonhard Seppala. Which brings us to perhaps the most inaccurate thing about this movie: Balto was never half wolf. On the contrary, he was about as purebred as they came. It's unknown when exactly he was born, but historians have pinpointed it to be sometime in the year 1919, meaning he was about 5 or 6 years old at the time of the pandemic. Balto also wasn't a stray dog as seen in the movie. On the contrary, he was owned by Seppala, who was a bit of a celebrity in a small town. Leonhard Seppala was originally born in Norway. In the year 1900, he immigrated to America, like many, in search of gold. And while he would never find the treasure of his dreams, he did find a new profession in dog racing. When he had his first dog team to train, Leonhard described that he literally fell in love with the dogs at first sight. "I could hardly wait for sledding snow to start their training." As the years went on, Seppala developed a reputation and was the musher of the town. He had won multiple races in Alaska and was seen as, quite possibly, the greatest musher of his time. Along the way, he would also begin to breed his dogs and even rent them out to other mushers or workers who needed the labor like in local coal mines. But then, one dog would come in and change the way he viewed his dogs. A dog that would become a champion. A hero. It was unlike any dog he had ever seen in his life. And that dog's name was Togo. Got your hopes up there a bit, didn't I? I know we haven't really gotten to the movie yet, but that's because the movie left, honestly, a whole lot out for the story that it chose to follow. Seppala doesn't even exist in the movie. Instead, Balto is a half-breed who is also raised by a goose? And a Russian one at that? At least make him Norwegian or something like Seppala was, come on! However, to the movie's credit, there is one thing that it did get right. Balto wasn't very liked. Not by the townspeople though, no, but by Seppala himself. Even though he loved his dogs, Seppala did see them as just animals that could be used, and so Seppala categorized them in two different ways: A dogs and B dogs. To be an A dog, you had to be like Togo. Togo was Seppala's favorite dog of them all. To Seppala, Togo was the greatest dog who had ever lived. Perfect in every way. Perfect height, perfect speed, perfect build. Look at them stats. Just the top of his class. You would never get a dog as perfect as Togo was. Balto, on the other hand, was a B dog. Too big, too slow, would never be a race dog in his entire life.
Loser! You're a loser! Are you feeling sorry for yourself? Well, you should be, because you are dirt! You make me sick, you big baby! Baby want a bottle? A big dirt bottle?
Why worry about a dog like that, when in his eyes, it would never be worth as much as another? Now, to some people, that might be seen as rather cruel, but that isn't to say Balto was abused in any way. Seppala simply just favored one dog over the others. And after spending years breeding and training hundreds of dogs, eventually, he started seeing them as a measuring stick for his own abilities, and Togo to him was the cream of the crop. Balto, on the other hand, would be rented out to a man by the name of Gunnar Kassan, who also happened to be from Norway as well. Interesting fact. Balto would become the leader of a team, but not for racing, but for transportation. You see, at the time, dog sleds were the primary mode of transportation and communication. There were no train routes or regular roads that extended up to that point in Alaska yet. These 1,300 people in Nome were practically cut off from the entire world, with Morse code being the only other way. It was this isolation, alongside a terrible winter, that would lead Nome into its darkest hour yet: the diphtheria epidemic. In the winter of 1924, Nome had only one doctor, a man by the name of Curtis Welsh. This man, alongside 4 nurses, were responsible for 1,300 people. Imagine that. Of the 1,300 people, 455 of them were Native Americans, primarily of the Inupiat tribe? Inupiat? British Joe, how do you say that word?
Inupiat.
Right, thank you. Diphtheria was referred to as a white man's disease, meaning that these natives, whose lands were already taken from them, were now facing a disease they had no built-up immunity for. That isn't to say, however, that the Caucasians were completely immune as well. Like in the movie, Curtis Welsh's office was entirely out of antitoxin, meaning that everyone was at great risk of the disease. When the epidemic began, children were ordered to immediately quarantine, but this sadly had little effect. For you see, it wasn't just in the city of Nome that this was happening. This was a nationwide pandemic. By the end of the 1920s, the United States had seen a whopping 100 to 200,000 cases of diphtheria. Around 10 to 15,000 of them would become fatalities, and a majority of these cases would belong to children. By late 1924, diphtheria was being taken very seriously, but Nome was practically cut off from the rest of the world, with Morse code being the only line to the rest of the country. Dr. Curtis Welsh would send this message directly to Washington, D.C. An epidemic of diphtheria is almost inevitable here. Stop. I am in urgent need of 1 million units of diphtheria antitoxin. Stop. Mail is only form of transportation. Stop. I have made application to Commissioner of Health of the Territories for antitoxin already. Stop. There are about 3,000 white natives in the district. Stop. And to make things worse, winter had arrived. And it was a bad one at that. This winter was one of the coldest ever recorded in American history. It reached an estimated negative 70 degrees Fahrenheit. With winds blowing at 50 miles per hour, planes were viable, but they decided against it as it could be too dangerous. And the ocean was frozen solid. There was no way a boat could make it to the shore in time. And the closest rail line was all the way in the city of Nenana. Nenana was a whopping 674 miles away from Nome. With every other way practically impossible, it seemed there was only one option: dog sleds. And now, without further ado, we're getting into the movie. Finally.
Well, took you long enough.
Okay, so obviously, just about every character in this movie is fictional, save for the Doctor and Balto himself. One character who is fictional, and is a great thing that he's fictional, would have to be Steel. Steel is the main antagonist of this movie, and is also a purebred Alaskan Malamute, which is actually interesting because they're considered very large dogs and thus not good race dogs. That isn't to say he wouldn't be a part of the serum run, but whoever Steel's trainer is, well, it's a miracle he's won any race at all, to be frank. Alaskan Malamutes are just way too big and heavy. Facts are facts. But with that being said, I get it. Clearly this is not 100% accurate to real dogs. There's other dog breeds that are probably even worse in this movie. I'm not a dog expert, so I don't know. I'm just stating what I know from my research. I will say this though, it's probably a good thing Steel is purely fictional because considering how despicable his character is, well, you'll see for yourself later. As for Balto, the animated version and the real version are very different from each other. Not to the point where it's indistinguishable, but there are notable differences. Where the animated version is brown with a light gray underbelly, the real Balto was almost entirely black, with patches of white, especially on his right front paw, which people called Balto's long sock, which sadly the animators didn't include in any character sheet that I could find. Okay, so in this movie, Nome holds a dog race to decide who would be the best sled to carry out the mission. This was probably to help simplify the story, as in real life, there were 20 mushers and 150 dogs that took part in the serum run. There was no race because, well, obviously time was of the essence. Like, guys, lives are on the line. Come on, get a move on. Planning ahead, some dog teams are already out and about, with the first team being led by William Wild Bill Shannon and his lead dog, Blackie. I swear that was the dog's name, I double-checked. Wild Bill was actually already on the train on the Nana, so he was the first to go. He would arrive at his designated handover point about a day later, his face covered black with frostbite, and 3 of his dogs dead from the cold. He traveled 53 miles, and that was just the beginning. So yeah, this movie's full of it. There's no way on heaven's great earth that Steel and his team would make it to Nenana and back all by themselves. Again, to recap, the distance between Nome and Nenana was 674 miles, and the first musher, Wild Bill, received severe frostbite and lost 3 dogs in his 53-mile trek. It's not happening. They do bring up other checkpoints in the movie at one point, but considering we still don't see any other teams in the movie anyway, I think this was just a loose way of connecting the movie to the real story. Which brings us to a huge chunk of the movie. It's purely fiction.
It's fiction. It's fiction. We made it up. We made this one up. It's a made-up tale. It's a total fabrication. It never happened.
Balto heading off on his own, facing that black bear, getting into a fight with Steel. None of it happened, and I don't think I really need to tell you that. From what I could find, there weren't any reported animal attacks on the mushers or their dogs. Again, from what I could find. What did happen was 20 teams and 150 dogs worked together to deliver the medicine to Nome. And now, I'm gonna let British Joe take over, because there are some names in here I know I'm gonna mispronounce, and he's way better at this, so British Joe, take it away.
You got it, RaisorBlade. Here are the names of the mushers who took part in the Serum Run of 1925 in the order they were in. William Wild Bill Shannon, Edgar Callens, Dan Green, Johnny Folger, Sam Joseph, Titus Nicolai, Dave Corning, Harry Pitka, Bill McCarty, Edgar Nolna, George Nolna, yes they were brothers, Charlie Evans, Tommy Patsy, Jack Nicolai, Victor Anajic, Miles Ganagnan, Henry Ivanoff, Leonard Sapala, Charlie Olson, Gunnar Carson, and finally Ed Ron.
Now, if you kept count of the names, you'll find that there were 21 of them, not 20 like I stated earlier, but that's because Ed Ron fell asleep and didn't make his run. So, in the end, it was Gunnar Kassan who would make the final trek, which for him made a total of 110 miles. And of course, you can probably guess who his lead dog was. Balto. As I said earlier, Gunnar Kassan had rented Balto to be the lead dog for a sled, simply so he could get around. But since then, he and Balto had formed an irrevocable bond. They had become the best of friends. So much so that when people who knew Gunnar personally described him before, they described him as quiet, antisocial, and rather glum. But after Balto showed up in his life, they described him differently. They described him as cheerful, social, and just a ray of sunshine. Balto had had a positive effect on his new master, which is proof positive that dogs are the greatest animals on the planet and deserve all the happiness in the world.
They're adorable and deserve all the happiness!
Even Hitler liked dogs, come on! During his final trek to Nome, there was a total whiteout. Gunnar couldn't see 2 feet in front of him, not even his own hands, but Gunnar chose to have faith in his best friend, and decided to charge forward into the storm, knowing that time was of the essence. When Gunnar reached the last checkpoint, he discovered that Ed Ron was asleep, so with the storm lighting up a bit, he decided rather than waste time prepping the new dogs and sled, he decided he would push on to the last 25 miles. And on February 2nd at 5:30 a.m., the Serum had finally reached Nome. When he pulled into Nome, Gunnar got off the sled and began to approach Balto, before collapsing from exhaustion. When people helped him to his feet, he could only mutter 3 words that he would use to describe Balto. A damn fine dog. By the time it reached Nome, the medicine was actually frozen solid, so the kids sadly had to wait a few hours before they could be treated, but the medicine was delivered, and Nome was effectively saved. Now, being a kids movie, of course they sugar-coated the event a bit. However, sadly, life isn't that happy. In the movie, it's believed that all of the kids were saved. However, in real life, there were casualties. The first casualty would be a 2-year-old Inuit boy. He would be misdiagnosed with tonsillitis and then die the very next day. Then 4 days later, a 7-year-old girl. In total, about 7 children would die. Their numbers would be included in the thousands of children who would also die from diphtheria across the nation. But with that being said, the mushers and their dogs weren't responsible for the ones who died. They were responsible for the ones they saved. It isn't shown in the movie, but the story of Nome had since spread across the country, and while the operation to get the medicine to Nome was still going on, soon enough, the entire country was rooting for them, and when Gunnar and Balto arrived in Nome on February 2nd, they received a hero's welcome. And what a hero's welcome it was. So the movie pretty much ends there. Balto is accepted by the town, he gets the girl, and Rosie goes on to live a full life. It's a happy ending for everybody, except for Steel, who's just no longer popular anymore. Kind of a weak punishment for him considering he was totally cool with kids dying in the end, but oh well. That'll teach us, Steel. Bad dog. So yeah, sorry we couldn't really follow the movie, but that's only because the movie doesn't follow history at all. As a movie goes, it's pretty good, if a bit generic in some places. But as a history lesson, it's kind of trash. About 95% of the film is fictional, with pretty much the only stuff that's accurate is the name of the places that the dog teams went to, and, well, I guess the technology is accurate, so there's also that. I don't know. I could talk about the sequels now, but yeah, Balto got fixed at a very young age, so he did not have any kids. But considering what the second movie is...
How did you do that?
I simply became one with the tree.
Tell me the age a kid is too old to sleep with a teddy. What the he say?
Balto having one kid, let alone a whole litter, is honestly the least inaccurate thing about that movie. As for the real Balto, well, the story doesn't end there, and it's sadly not all that happy. But we'll carry on. After Balto and Kassin returned to Nome, they became overnight celebrities. They would go on tour all across the nation. Celebrities would travel around to meet the heroic dog. To the media, it was like candy on Halloween. A team of dogs saved a bunch of kids? That's pretty much what Lassie would be about. People love that stuff. But back in Nome, Alaska, there were people that weren't too happy. And one of them was Sapala himself. You remember earlier that Sapala was one of the 20 mushers who took part in the serum run, but we didn't discuss how far he went. While Kassin and Balto traveled 110 miles and ended up being the last team to Nome, Sapala and his lead dog, Togo, would travel an astonishing 261 miles. 170 miles just to where they were supposed to meet Henry Ivanov and receive the serum, and then another 91 miles just so they could hand it off to Charlie Olsen. During their trek, Togo led the team across a frozen river that began to break apart, and yet Togo and his team persevered. They made it across the lake, and Sapala showed everyone why he was given the longest and most dangerous part of the Iditarod Trail. As such, he and many other people believed that Balto and Kassin, He and many other people believed that Balto and Kassin were stealing the credit from the other dogs and mushers. Which, yeah, they kind of were, but to be fair, that wasn't their fault. That's just how the media is.
You are fake news.
At one point, Sapala even started a rumor that Kassin purposefully chose to pass over Ed Ron for the sole purpose of getting the limelight. But many historians have since determined that that would be impossible, since at the time, Kassin and Balto were effectively cut off from the rest of the world. Kassin couldn't have possibly known that the story had broken out and the whole entire country was rooting for him. Basically, Sapala was jealous of the fact that Balto, a dog that he described as a scrub dog who was never in a winning team, was now being celebrated like one, not his precious Togo. But with that being said, Sapala does have a point. It took 20 mushers and 150 dogs all to complete the mission, so for Balto and Kassin to receive all of the credit really is unfair. Which is why when Balto had a statue of him erected in New York City, which is still there to this day, Sapala took note of the irony of the quote that's on the statue. Dedicated to the indomitable spirit of the sled dogs that relayed antitoxin 600 miles over rough ice, across treacherous waters, through Arctic blizzards from the Nana to the relief of stricken Nome in the winter of 1925. Endurance, fidelity, intelligence. And yet, only one dog was getting all that fame. This is what Sapala had to say about it. I hope I shall never be the man to take away credit from any dog or driver who participated in that run. We all did our best. But when the country was roused to enthusiasm over the serum run driver, I resented the statue of Balto, for if any dog deserved special mention, it was Togo. At the time I left, I never dreamed that anyone would consider these dogs fit to drive even a short relay. As to the leader, it was up to the driver, who happened to be selected to choose any dog he liked, and he chose Balto. Eventually, Togo would receive some of the fame he deserved. He and Sapala would later go on their own tour across the West Coast, and together they would draw large crowds. At one point, Togo was even given a gold medal by Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen. So yeah, Togo did receive some love after all, just not as much as Balto did. You thought that statue made Sapala mad? You should have seen his face when Balto would star in his very own movie. That's right, Paramount Pictures actually made a movie about Balto's exploits titled Balto's Race to Nome. However, in a sad twist of fate, a fire at Paramount Pictures in the 1930s would destroy the film. it no longer exists. Eventually, the story would die down, and life would go back to normal for the dogs, and this meant that Balto would return to his original owner. By this point, Sapala wanted nothing to do with Balto. So, what did he do? He sold Balto and some of the other dogs to the highest bidder. You'd think that after all the time they spent together, Kasen would be the one to buy Balto, but sadly he tried, but he was unable to make the winning bid. Balto and 6 other dogs would be sold to a traveling circus for an unknown amount. Sadly, Kasen would never see his best friend again. And for the next 2 years, life for Balto and those dogs would be an utter living hell. Mistreated, kept on chains, and malnourished, Balto and the dogs were treated like nothing more than props in a vaudeville circuit. Eventually, they'd end up in a cheap dime store in LA where they would receive the attention of a man named George Kimball. George Kimball was a businessman who was on vacation from the city of Cleveland, and he was horrified to see the dogs in such poor condition. So he struck up a deal with the owner and asked how much would it cost to buy Balto's freedom. The answer was $2,000, or more than $34,000 in today's money. Now, Kimball didn't have that money, but he couldn't just let the dogs suffer, so thankfully, he began Operation Save Balto. With only 2 weeks to raise the money, Kimball began to spread the word and ask people for donations to help raise the $2,000. What he didn't expect, however, was for the story to spread like wildfire. The story made it on the radio, and eventually people in the dozens, maybe even hundreds, were donating what they could. Even kids were running in the street with their own piggy banks, all to donate what pennies they had, all so they could help the heroic dogs. Balto was worth about $2,000. In total, Kimball went on to raise $2,300. More than enough for Balto and the 6 other dogs. Within 10 days, the dogs would be liberated from that dime store and brought back to Cleveland, where they were given another hero's welcome. Balto and the other dogs got their own parade through Public Square, as they were then brought to their new home, the Cleveland Metro Park Zoo, at the time called the Brookside Zoo. Balto and the other dogs would be cleaned up, well-fed, and were then given their own exhibit where they could live the rest of their lives in dignity. Balto and the others received an estimated 15,000 visitors on their first day. From then on, Balto and the other dogs would be the star attractions for the zoo up until the year 1933. By that year, Balto had reached the ripe old age of 14. By that time, Balto was a very old dog, and like with all good dogs, sadly, he went way too soon. Balto would pass away from old age on March 14, 1933. The nation mourned Balto, as he was still viewed as the dog that saved the lives of hundreds of children. Leonhard Sapala would carry on his work as a dog breeder and racer. In 1932, dog sledding had officially become an Olympic event, and Sapala was chosen to represent the United States, going on to win the silver medal. He would retire in 1946 and move to Seattle, Washington with his wife Constance, where he lived until his death at the ripe old age of 89 on January 28, 1967. He and his wife are buried in Nome, Alaska. Togo would retire from racing in 1927. He would enjoy a rather comfortable retirement in Poland, Maine until in December of 1929, at the ripe old age of 16, he would be humanely euthanized by Sapala himself. Gunnar Kasen would never fully recover from losing his best friend, but he would still go on to live a full life. I couldn't find out that much about his life other than the fact that Kasen would go on to move to Everett, Washington with his wife Anna in 1952, where he would live for the remainder of his life. He passed away from cancer on November 27, 1960 at the age of 78. Both Balto and Togo would be stuffed and mounted and put up on displays for people to come visit them. Togo currently rests at the Iditarod Trail Sled Dog Race Headquarters Museum in Wasilla, Alaska. There in the museum, you'll find a quote from Leonhard Sapala about Togo. "I never had a better dog than Togo. His stamina, loyalty, and intelligence could not be improved upon. Togo was the best dog that ever traveled the Alaska Trail." Fortunately, Togo would receive more attention in later years, even having a movie made about him in 2019 starring Willem Dafoe. And interestingly enough, the dog that portrays Togo in the film, named Diesel, is actually a descendant of Togo 14 times back. That's just really cool. Balto currently rests in the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, where he receives hundreds of visitors every day. The real story of Balto is a truly heroic one. However, it sadly overshadows the heroism of 19 other mushers and 149 other dogs. Now, that isn't really Balto's fault though. I mean, after all, he was just a dog. It's not like he wanted to be famous. All Balto knew was how to follow his master's orders. And as Sapala said, he just so happened to have been chosen by the right guy at the right time. Just like the other dogs and mushers, Balto's actions did save the lives of hundreds of kids. Were it not for him, 20 mushers, and 149 other dogs, there's no telling how many lives would have been lost in the city of Nome that year, or if there would even be a Nome remaining afterward. The movie Balto isn't a great history lesson, but it does do one thing right, and that's get people interested, to learn the story of all of the dogs, the mushers, and the Serum Run itself. The legend of Balto, Togo, and all of those dogs still live on in the Iditarod Trail sled dog race, which goes on every year to this day, following the same path that Balto and Togo did almost 100 years ago. We can talk about which dog did better or worse. We can make the same mistake that people back in 1925 did, idolizing one dog over the others. But I think we should prove that humanity can learn from history, and thus its mistakes. I ask you, the viewer, not to think less of Balto or more of Togo. Instead, use the lesson as a reminder. 20 mushers and 150 dogs all gave everything, some even more than that, all to save the lives of children in desperate need. It wasn't one hero or two, it was 170, all deserving of recognition, all deserving of respect, and all deserving of being remembered. Also, they're dogs! Come on! How can you hate a dog for something people did? Assholes!